Ptah, the divine mind that constructs reality. Welcome back to Ancient the Architect TV. Today we're going to enter a current of metaphysics that most people never touch, not because it's too advanced, but because it doesn't flatter the ego. It doesn't entertain. It doesn't perform. It explains. And it explains something so foundational that if you don't understand it, you can study spiritual concepts for 10 years and still not understand how anything actually becomes real. The subject is Ptah. Now, the first thing you have to understand is that Ptah is not a character. Ptah is not merely a historical deity in a pantheon. Ptah is a metaphysical function, a principle that describes a level of reality and a specific operation in the architecture of manifestation. If you approach Ptah like a mythological figure the way people approach other gods, as a personality, as a drama, as a story, you miss him instantly. Ptah is not mostly found in story. Ptah is found in structure. Ptah is what exists before story can exist. Ptah is what exists before emotion can exist. Ptah is what exists before the soul can even describe itself. Because Ptah is the divine mind. Not mind the way modern people think of mind, not opinions and memory and thoughts racing. I'm talking about mind as cosmic intelligence, mind as the interior architecture of the Logos. Ptah represents the phase where the supreme principle becomes intelligible as an ordering power. That's the key. There are levels where the supreme is too absolute to be spoken of. There are levels where it is pure, unconditioned, beyond form, beyond articulation. But there is also a point, a threshold, where the supreme becomes the capacity to generate structure. That threshold is what Ptah symbolizes. Ptah is the architect mode of the supreme. So when we say Ptah is the divine mind, we are saying something very precise. We are describing the supreme self operating as the blueprint holder of the universe, not the energy of the universe. Not the emotion of the universe, not the astral force of the universe, the blueprint, the idea that reality is designed before it is expressed. This is why Ptah belongs to the highest operations of the mental plane, not the lower mental plane where the mind collects information and becomes clever, but the higher mental plane where mind is creative causation. It is the place where archetype is still intact. It is the place where form is still pure. It is the place where reality is not happening randomly. It is being constructed from within intelligence. And here's what that means practically. If Ptah is the divine mind, then creation is not first physical. Creation is not first emotional. Creation is not first energetic. Creation is first conceptual. Not in the shallow sense, but in the cosmic sense, that the first act of manifestation is the emergence of a thought structure inside being itself. That implies something radical. The universe is not primarily a machine. It is a thought articulated into form. And that is why Ptah is so important for anyone trying to understand spiritual development at an elite level. Because if you do not grasp the architect level of reality, you will treat spirituality like coping, or mood management, or vibes, and you will miss the mechanism by which the soul evolves into divine coherence. Ptah and the ladder of causation. Now let's get more exact. A complete metaphysical system has to account for how the unmanifest becomes manifest. You need to be able to map the ladder. How pure potential becomes intelligible ordering. How ordering becomes articulated command. How command becomes energetic execution. How execution becomes the descending worlds of experience. Ptah occupies the rung where the supreme begins to function as ordering intelligence. But Ptah does not operate alone. He appears in relation to other divine principles, because cosmic operations are never isolated. This is where you need to understand the difference between the architect, the voice, the power, the visible emanation. When people confuse these, they end up with vague theology. Ptah is the architect. There is a principle that expresses the architect's will as intelligible articulation. There is a principle that energizes the design into life. And there is a principle that governs how the soul becomes aligned with that design. So Ptah is the design intelligence, the mind of divine creation. Now, if Ptah is the divine mind, then what does that mean for the human being? It means Ptah is also the prototype of what the perfected mind becomes when it stops serving appetite and starts serving truth. Let me say that clearly. The human mind, in its lower condition, is a servant of desire. In its higher condition, it becomes a servant of divine order. That transition is one of the major events in the evolution of the soul. Ptah symbolizes that transition in its perfected form. Mind that is no longer confused, no longer scattered, no longer subordinated to the lower nature, but mind operating as the craftsman of reality. Ptah as the generator of the inner image. Here's the next layer. If mind is the architect, then mind necessarily generates images, not fantasies. Images as archetypal structures. At the highest level, the divine mind projects a likeness of itself into the planes where soul can exist as a distinct being. This likeness is not a physical picture. It is a metaphysical imprint, a pattern of divine qualities and capacities. This is where most people get lost, because they imagine image as a body. But the true image is a configuration of divine attributes within consciousness. And when that configuration becomes stable, it becomes the prototype for what the perfected human being will ultimately become. So Ptah, as the divine mind, is directly related to the projection of divine nature into knowable form, the establishment of the soul's highest blueprint, and the creation of a perfected humanity that exists first as potentially complete on the higher planes, before it is actually complete on the lower planes. This is not religion. This is metaphysical mechanics. It means that above the changing human condition, there is a level where humanity exists as an already perfected archetype, not as a crowd of individuals, but as a unified prototype. And this prototype is not optional. It is the directive cause behind evolution itself. Evolution, at the highest level, is not random adaptation. Evolution is the progressive externalization of an inner, pre-existent perfection. That's why the soul carries a sense of, I am meant for more, even when the lower life is chaotic. That sense is not imagination. It is the pressure of the archetype upon the evolving form. And if Ptah is the divine mind, then Ptah is intimately involved in that archetype, because the archetype is a mental blueprint. This is what makes Ptah so deadly serious. Ptah is the force that makes the difference between a life of scattered experiences and a life that is assembled into destiny. Because the architect principle is what gives you structure that compounds. Ptah and the two worlds of mind. Now we have to address something crucial. There is a reason that ancient systems treat Egypt not only as a historical nation, but as a symbol of a plane of consciousness. And that symbol is not random. It's diagnostic, because there is a version of mind that is lower, brilliant, educated, worldly, skilled, but still enslaved to externality. It is mind that can build technology, build wealth, build arguments, build reputations, but cannot build the soul. And then there is a higher mind that becomes aligned with the divine blueprint and begins to function as the interior architect of spiritual ascent. The lower mind is where the soul gathers experience and becomes sophisticated. The higher mind is where the soul becomes coherent, integrated, and spiritually authorized. And Ptah belongs to the higher operation. So Ptah is not simply intelligence. Ptah is intelligence that has been consecrated. Intelligence that serves the real. Intelligence that can touch the planes of archetype and translate them into structured existence. This is why, in a true initiatic system, the goal is not to become smarter, The goal is to become structurally aligned. Ptah is what the mind becomes when it stops being a prison and becomes a temple. Ptah and the gate of expression. Now we reach one of the most powerful implications. A God is not real to the soul until it can be expressed. A divine quality is not real to the soul until it can be articulated, lived, transmitted, embodied. And there is a specific metaphysical event in the soul's evolution where inner divinity moves from being a silent presence into being an expressed power. This event is the transition from latent consciousness to expressed consciousness, from inner knowing to spoken truth to lived alignment. And Ptah is involved in this, because Ptah governs the conditions under which the soul becomes able to express its indwelling self. This is not public speaking. This is metaphysical permission. The soul does not express higher truth simply because it wants to. It expresses higher truth when the lower bindings are loosened, the higher mind is awake. The will has become an instrument of truth, and the internal temple has been cleansed of the forces that distort expression. So Ptah is the architect not only of worlds, but of the soul's voice. Meaning, Ptah is the principle through which the inner divine becomes communicable. That is why Ptah can be understood as the mind that opens the possibility of divine speech. Not speech as sound, but speech as manifestation through ordered intelligence. If you do not have Ptah functioning in you, you may be spiritual, but you will remain in fragments. You will have insights, but not structure. You will have moments, but not mastery. Ptah is mastery. Ptah is coherence. Ptah is the mind that can build a world that actually reflects the real, the blueprint before emanation. To understand Ptah at the most supreme metaphysical level, we now have to make a critical distinction that most spiritual systems collapse far too quickly. There is a difference between the logos as blueprint and the logos as emanation. Most people only ever encounter the logos once it has already become expressive, as light, as vitality, as divine presence, as solar consciousness. That level is powerful, inspiring, and transformative, but it is not the beginning. Ptah belongs to what comes before that. Ptah represents the logos prior to visibility, prior to energy, prior to movement. This is the logos at rest, not inactive but internally ordered, holding within itself the complete design of manifestation before a single vibration occurs. This is why Ptah is associated with mind rather than light. Light is already movement. Light is already outward. Light is already communicative. Mind, at this level, is interior causation. So when we speak of Ptah as the divine mind, we are speaking of the logos in its architectural phase, the stage where reality exists as a fully coherent, internally unified conception. This is subtle but essential. The universe does not begin with power. It begins with intelligibility. Power without intelligibility is chaos. Intelligibility without power is potential. Ptah is intelligibility. The logos at the Ptahic level is the supreme self thinking itself into form, but not yet projecting that form outward. Everything exists as mental order, not as event. This has massive implications for spiritual development, because it means that true spiritual mastery does not begin with energy work, emotional purification, or even moral effort. It begins with alignment to the inner architecture of truth. Until the mind itself is aligned to the divine blueprint, power will only magnify distortion. That is why Ptah is so dangerous to superficial spirituality. He cannot be accessed through feeling alone. He requires mental consecration, the supreme self, becoming the indwelling self. Now we need to descend one level, carefully. The supreme self, at the absolute level, is not personal. It is not individual. It is not localized. It is pure being, pure reality, pure source. But the supreme does not remain forever unapproachable. There is a phase where the Supreme becomes eminent, not by diminishing itself, but by expressing itself as an interior presence within evolving beings. This is one of the most important transitions in metaphysics. The Supreme does not fragment itself. It reflects itself. That reflection is what becomes the indwelling self, the living core within the soul that carries divine identity, divine memory, and divine direction. Ptah is directly involved in this process because the reflection of the Supreme into the soul is not emotional or physical. It is structural. The indwelling self is not just God inside you as a comforting idea. It is a precise metaphysical implantation of divine order into the inner constitution of the soul. Think of it this way. The Supreme is infinite and undifferentiated. The indwelling self is the Supreme formatted for evolution. That formatting happens through mind. Ptah governs that formatting, which means Ptah is the principle through which the absolute becomes intelligible within the soul without ceasing to be absolute. This is why the indwelling self is often described as self-created or self-existent, not because it is separate from the Supreme, but because it carries within itself the complete authority of the Source, expressed inwardly. So Ptah is not merely cosmic. Ptah is intimately interior. He is the reason the soul contains a guiding intelligence that does not originate in experience, memory, culture, or education. That guiding intelligence is architectural, not emotional. It knows where the soul is meant to go because it already contains the blueprint of completion. The higher mind. As intermediary. Now we reach a point that is absolutely essential for clarity. Between the indwelling self and the lower personality, there exists a mediating faculty. This faculty is the higher mind. The higher mind is not the intellect as people usually understand it. It is not analytical cleverness, nor is it abstract speculation. The higher mind is the bridge between eternal principles and temporal experience. It is the faculty that can receive archetypal truth without distorting it into opinion. Ptah operates through this higher mind. That is why Ptah is not associated with the lower mental plane of accumulation, strategy, and worldly knowledge, but with the higher mental plane where mind becomes receptive to divine order. At this level, mind no longer invents truth. It recognizes it. It does not argue. It aligns. It does not dominate reality. It constructs according to reality. This is why the higher mind is often depicted as functioning between two worlds, the eternal and the temporal. It stands between the perfected archetype and the evolving form. And its role is translation. Not translation into language, but translation into structure. This is the difference between someone who has spiritual insight and someone who has spiritual authority. Authority comes from structural alignment, and Ptah is the patron of that alignment. Archetype and actualization. Now we need to address the concept of pre-existent perfection, because without this, Ptah makes no sense. There exists a level where humanity is already perfected, not as individual personalities, but as a unified archetypal pattern. This archetypal humanity is not imaginary. It is not symbolic in the weak sense. It is metaphysically real. It exists as the completed form of what humanity is becoming, the directive cause behind evolution, the silent standard toward which all souls are drawn. Evolution does not invent this archetype. Evolution unfolds it. This is crucial. If there were no pre-existent perfection, evolution would have no direction, only motion. But evolution has direction. Souls mature. Consciousness integrates. Identity coheres. Fragmentation resolves. That direction is imposed from above, not generated from below. Ptah governs the relationship between the archetype and the evolving soul, because the archetype itself is a mental structure. It is a divine idea. And every soul, at its deepest level, carries a resonance with that idea. a memory, not in time, but in being. This is why people feel discontent even when materially successful. It is not dissatisfaction with circumstances. It is misalignment with the archetype. And Ptah is the principle that restores alignment by reintroducing structure, wisdom as the receptive womb of form. Now we must introduce another layer, and this is delicate. The divine mind does not operate in isolation. It requires a receptive principle that can receive, gestate, and preserve the archetypal designs until they are ready to descend further. This receptive principle is wisdom. Not wisdom as information, but wisdom as spiritual substance. Wisdom is the plane where archetypes are held intact without distortion. Think of it as the womb of divine ideas. Mind conceives, wisdom receives, form eventually emerges. This relationship explains why some truths can be known mentally, but not yet lived. They have been conceived, but not yet gestated. Ptah, as the divine mind, projects. Wisdom holds. The soul evolves to embody. This also explains why spiritual impatience is destructive. You cannot force embodiment before gestation is complete. Ptah designs. Wisdom matures. Time unfolds. Lunar transmutation and the ascent mechanism. Now we descend into the mechanism of transformation. The soul does not ascend directly from instinct to divinity. It ascends through cycles of refinement, where lower material is transmuted into higher substance. This is where the lunar principle comes into play, not merely as a symbol of emotion or desire, but as the alchemy of experience. At the lower level, experience is raw, chaotic, reactive. As the soul evolves, experience is refined, distilled, purified. At the higher level, experience becomes integrated wisdom. The lunar function is the container of this process. It gathers experience, processes it, and hands it upward. But without Ptah, this process remains unconscious. With Ptah active, experience is organized. The soul stops repeating cycles blindly and begins to extract meaning. This is when karma becomes curriculum. This is when suffering becomes instruction. This is when life becomes coherent. The solar completion. All of this culminates in the solar principle, the harmonizer. Once the mind is aligned, once wisdom has matured, once experience has been transmuted, the soul enters a state of radiant coherence. This is not egoic power. It is presence. It is identity without fragmentation. It is the state where the higher and lower selves are no longer at war. And this is where the divine blueprint becomes fully visible in life. But notice the sequence. Blueprint, Ptah, reception, wisdom, transmutation, lunar process, harmonization, solar completion. Skip the blueprint, and everything collapses into mysticism without mastery. Seamless entry into myth and legend. Now, and only now, are we ready to talk about myth. Because myth is not entertainment. Myth is compressed metaphysics. The ancient stories about Ptah, the silent creator, the heart and the tongue, the one who thinks the gods into being, are not primitive beliefs. They are symbolic encodings of everything we've just laid out. When Ptah is said to create through heart and speech, it is not literal anatomy. It is the statement that mind conceives and articulation manifests. When Ptah is said to precede other gods, it is not rivalry. It is hierarchy of causation. When Ptah opens the mouth, it is not ritual magic. It is the moment consciousness becomes authorized to express divine truth. When Ptah stands at the head of a triad, it is not family drama. It is the structural relationship between design, force, and perfected form. Ptah is quiet in myth because he operates before drama exists. Drama belongs to the soul in time. Ptah belongs to the intelligence that builds time itself. In closing, why Ptah matters now. If there is one reason this teaching matters today, it is this. Modern spirituality has power without architecture. People feel energy but lack structure. They sense purpose but lack direction. They awaken emotionally but remain fragmented mentally. Ptah restores architecture. Ptah teaches that enlightenment is not escape, it is construction. It is the assembly of the soul according to divine design. And until that design is understood, the soul will wander. Spiritual, inspired, but incoherent. Ptah is coherence. Ptah is the mind of God thinking you into wholeness. And that is why Ptah is not popular. But Ptah is essential. Return from the architect's plane. So as we close this episode, understand what you've just been given. This was not mythology. This was not symbolism for entertainment. This was not spiritual inspiration. This was architecture. Ptah is not a god you pray to for favors. Ptah is the principle that determines whether your inner world has structure or not. If your life feels scattered, if your insight does not compound, if your growth resets instead of builds, that is not fate, and it is not lack of effort. It is lack of architectural alignment. Ptah represents the level of consciousness where the soul stops reacting to life and begins constructing itself according to truth. And that is the difference between awakening and mastery. If this episode challenged you, that is intentional. If it required focus, that is intentional. If it reorganized how you understand mind, self, and divinity, that is the work. This channel exists for those who are no longer satisfied with surface spirituality, motivational language, or borrowed beliefs. Ancient the Architect TV is about reclaiming the internal architecture of the soul. If this episode expanded your understanding, subscribe. Not for notifications, but because this body of work is cumulative. Each episode builds on the last. If you know someone who is serious about real metaphysical understanding, not trends, not aesthetics, share this episode with them. And if you want to support the continuation of this work, like the video, so it reaches those who are searching for structure, not spectacle. We'll continue this work, slowly, precisely, and without dilution. Until next time, remain aligned, remain sovereign, and remain architected.